I think these are really, all three of them, really excellent papers. And I'm normally not one to hunt for a common line when I'm asked to present on a panel. But I think in this case, it's worth to point out that all three papers in their own way are trying to come to grips with cross-national variation. And you could almost say this is a second stage in us grappling with the turbulent times, that we are actually now trying to understand why the turbulent times are more turbulent in some countries than another. So I'll start with Catherine's paper, and I'll take them in the order of presentation here. Catherine is asking, why is public support for Europe most vulnerable in countries that have weathered the Euro crises or the crises better than others? And her response is that it depends on the outside options. And these in turn depend primarily on a country's viability outside the EU. And she calls this benchmarking, and I find this a very powerful heuristic, because it's also a problem that has bedeviled us in the sense that, in terms of at least scholars of public opinion, in the sense that most people have neither the knowledge nor the motivation to go out and search for facts. And so this is a way of understanding where people might get their cues. And it's a very simple, straightforward way, more powerful than Matt Gabel's national proxies, I think. And that's really quite a contribution. To put it more crudely, much more crudely than Catherine does in her book or even in the paper, people who judge their countries to do consistently better than the EU are more likely to be Eurosceptic. And to the extent they judge their country to do better on several dimensions, they're more likely to opt out, to support a Brexit or an exit or a Swexit. It's a really interesting original contribution in several ways. Benchmarking is a way of creating a linchpin between the national and the European. So it's a genuinely multi-level way of thinking about European politics and European Union politics, which I think is very interesting. You can imagine why I find that very interesting. The arguments...
Liesbet was my advisor, so that was
okay.
multi-level, that's not
yeah. The other thing, which is, I think, really neat, is that the argument can work at a country level and at the individual level. And particularly in Catherine's book, there's a lot of analysis at the individual level. So you refer to it very briefly in your presentation, but the paper itself is much more focused on the national level. So you can make predictions about the overall public opinion in a country, but you can also make predictions about where individuals in a particular country in a given setting stand. And the third is that benchmarking has this robust psychological micro-foundation in prospect theory. You didn't mention that here either, but the book provides a solid foundation for that. On to my comments and perhaps ways of how you could expand this, deepen this, apply this, and so forth. I have 3 comments on theory, and I'll try to be brief on this. The first is to make the connection with politicization and the politicization literature, to put it very pragmatically with a lot of the papers here at the conference, including the 2 subsequent ones. It's not a moving part here, and it's also not really there in your book, which is a little interesting because you yourself have contributed a lot to the literature. I seem to remember a certain paper published about 10 years ago on queuing and radical right parties and identity, for example. But I think we would agree that this benchmarking doesn't happen at an individual level, in individuals isolated in their bedroom or in their living room, but rather in the context of social and political discourse. And so bringing in this idea of political entrepreneurs and how they might shape the benchmarking process and the updating continually, I think would get us, would really enrich the theory that you develop. The second theoretical comment relates to the notion of national viability, which you describe as a particularly current national economic performance and quality of government relevance relative to the average EU country. That's easy to understand. It's always trickier to operationalize, but easy to understand conceptually, and that's a real virtue. But my suggestion is to consider how this might work differently, if you'd like to think of a conditional factor, an interaction perhaps, for smaller and larger countries. Smaller countries are much more dependent on international governance to reap the benefits of scale, from trade to migration management and so forth. And this is something that comes out very powerfully in the book that we're currently writing, which is on international authority of international organizations, 76 of them. And it's just simply clear that smaller countries are much more likely to want and tolerate and push for supranational governance. So we call this the benefits of scale gain, which vary. You know, if you're Estonian and you sleep next to the big bear, you might just be a little less reluctant, even if your country does relatively well, to give up that protection. So I think thinking of national viability in the context of this broader notion of variation in benefits of scale would also enrich your theory. And the third one has to do with, actually takes off from your Brexit vote experiment that you develop more detailed in the book. And it shows that, or suggests that benchmarking is not just a national specific process, but that individuals and also political entrepreneurs are capable of internalizing the information that they reap from looking at how other countries are doing. So this brings in the notion of what I call multi-level learning there. That's what you see on the slide. Again, I want to push you there to think this through more deeply, because I think you got the beginnings of this in your book. And you can think of conditions under which this learning process may be facilitated or inhibited. Two you have ready-made in your theory. It's a pre-existing EU national differential, and the strength of entrepreneurs. I think that those are two elements. But the third I would suggest is the size and the strategic importance of what I would call a transnational constituency. You could also say the Macron voters, right? I mean, people who are, by the way they live their lives, are not bound to a particular national context, right? And so that's where I want to finish then in terms of how generalizable is what you're saying beyond the EU context. And I think that's a real hallmark of the power of a theory. If it is generalizable beyond a specific case, then we really have something to hold on to. And I think my answer is yes. I think it can travel. And I think your hypothesis that successful international cooperation may generate its own skeptics is provocative in this context. But again, I'd like you to think about countervailing factors. And I think I want you to do this intellectually, but frankly, I also think that we need to think about countervailing factors just to get out of our potential pessimism. And again, in part I repeat, but I think the potentially two most important countervailing factors I can think of is that size and importance of a transnational constituency, people who are vested in fighting back the return to the national and particularly the exclusive national. And then the other is that notion of what I call scale gain, that is the inexorable benefits of transnational cooperation in whichever shape. And I think that's how that affects people's calculations or estimates of benchmarking will vary, and I think we want to get a grip on that. Time to move on. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. Sven and Hans-Peter's paper, which is, I think, a really super paper. I'm not going to repeat the argument because Hans-Peter really summarized it for me, thankfully. But the bottom line really is one of continuity prevails after the crisis. But it's a peculiar kind of continuity. It's a reinforcement of the ongoing processes of transformation that didn't start with the crises, that long preceded it. I think this paper is going to get a lot of citations for a number of reasons. One is that wonderful synthesis, and again, Hans-Peter summarized it, so I don't have to do it, but the wonderful synthesis that sets out the paths, the different waves or the phases of transformation. We're now in the third stage, and I think you focus rightly with respect to Northwest Europe on the new right, as you call them, as the critical kind of factor or set of actors that are going to be decisive on how this transformation is going to shape up. This is, I think, one of the first times that you really come out unabashedly as this is a cultural divide. I know you've been saying this, certainly in conversations, but this is now also very sharply on paper. And you also justify why this is so. You have an interesting couple of paragraphs there where you talk about it's not the decline of the economic dimension, it has had its own transformation in the sense that it's no longer much, again we're talking about Northwest Europe, no longer much a matter of a positional competition, but much more one where the positions are now so close, or relatively close at least, and where the competition is much more about ownership and competence. And that's equally competitive, but it's a different kind of competition, and it opens up space for a truly positional debate on cultural issues. So I think that's a really neat way of looking at it. I think for me, the most innovative part of the paper, even though it's probably also the part that is most in progress, is the measures that you introduce. And I really appreciated to seeing those measures of party configuration or party structuration, because they help to kind of clarify where, and in terms of benchmark, if I can borrow that word, benchmark countries versus each other and where they stand. My comments are very brief. One has to do with politicization, your politicization measure, which is, as you explained, a product of salience and polarization. But the way I read your polarization component, it's also highly salience affected, I was going to say, I look for a better word, salience dominated. And you have two parameters there that refer to salience. So I'm just wondering why this overpowering role for salience? Why not a cleaner positional operationalization of polarization, which you then multiply with salience? And have you considered perhaps using a positional measure, the SHS, to provide an objective positional anchor there? And there is, this is something where I want to also say mea culpa. I think Hans-Peter is right that several people in the room, but particularly Gary, myself, and you guys, your project, Edgar, we're thinking along very similar lines conceptually and theoretically. But I think maybe it would be nice to really start using each other's data much more intensively, because we are looking at the same reality through different lenses, and that it's quite interesting that we actually arrive at very consistent conclusions. And my last point, and then I'll move to the third paper, and it is one that actually is a linchpin to the third paper anyway. The Achilles heel of any factor analysis, and your multidimensional scaling is a form of factor analysis, of course, that there's no absolute or stable reference point. You know, what you get out of it in part depends on what you put in, right? You know, how many countries, how many parties, how many time points, and so forth. So, and this is really, I was just staring at some of the figures across the two papers, and then I realized they weren't directly comparable, because the Northwest paper takes the comparison right up to 2017, and the broader comparative paper doesn't. But let me ask the question anyway. How robust would be the statistic, for example, of the angle with which you measure the tripolar or bipolarization? If you throw in more countries or more issues, would it exactly produce the same number, or would the numbers change? And this is really something for both papers, certainly not only for the Hooghe and CRISES paper. So very briefly on the last paper, this is in many ways a real tour de force. Original data for 15 countries across Europe, very broad also in terms of time frame. It's really quite impressive. You seek to identify what is shared and what is different across these 15 countries. And in a nutshell, you find some commonality, but you also find some difference, which again is interesting, because, and Gary will be talking this afternoon about our recent results, this is also what we find. I think we emphasize perhaps more the commonality than you do. You point out also quite a lot of the differences. But again, this is quite consistency using very different data. This is, of course, a chapter, not a paper. And so there's a lot in there. If you were to want to turn this in a paper or part of it in a paper, the part that I actually find really interesting is the part you didn't talk about in the presentation, is your focus on the nexus between the economic left and the cultural. And your question, okay, if you get this alignment of economic and culture, which part of the culture is it? And particularly, how does that work in the economic left? Economic left, broadly speaking, the center left, radical left, new left, and so forth. To what extent do you see an alignment there, and around what kind of issues? I think that is really innovative. I know it's a subsection of the paper, but I'd never seen this analysis before. I just have very brief questions here. Definition. What's economic, what's cultural? Part of it is seems to me a little bit maybe ad hoc, particularly what you put in the political category there, why you decide to put Europe there alongside democratic renewal. And I'm wondering whether, because I think you can do that, right? I mean, you're being deductive, and most of the time deductive is better than inductive. But you presumably could also inductively run some factor analysis and see how these items align and whether indeed they group in these four broad categories that you use to talk about comparison. So I'm just wondering how that would come up. And then I think I'm going to stop here because we can talk one-to-one about point 2 and 3. They didn't come up in the presentation, and it might just make more sense to do that one-to-one with you guys later. Okay, that's it.